What is dry needling and should I use it for my rehab?
Brian, thank you for your question. It's I think a two-part answer is what I'll try to summarize this into. But I think we should start with what is dry needling. A lot of people listening, they may have never heard of this and are wondering, like, what is dry needling? It sounds kind of scary, but sounds kind of cool. Like, what is this thing? So, dry needling is using an acupuncture needle to then put into a trigger point that might be causing a person's symptoms. What is a trigger point? It's a sensitized area of nerve bundles. They're commonly in areas that are overstressed. Good example is the upper traps, these muscles on your shoulders. You can poke around and find some very sensitive areas in there. They tend to be in these muscles that are very much holding on to stressors, right? So dry needling is then finding that trigger point, putting the needle into that trigger point, leaving it there or moving it around, or you can get fancy and hook up electrical stimulation to the needle and then it kind of pulsates down into that trigger
Mm.
point. You can see the muscle like actually contracting and relaxing, contracting and relaxing. So pretty cool how it's done. In New York State, physical therapists are not allowed to do it, but in almost every other state, physical therapists are allowed to do it. California is another exception. So PTs aren't able to do it here, but they can do it basically anywhere else. So what is actually going on? What does it actually do? Is it worthwhile of having? And it's very interesting, right? Because I don't want to get into acupuncture because that's more Eastern medicine and that would involve different thought processes. But dry needling is more of a Western practice that was derived from the Eastern practice. But what does the research show with dry needling? It shows that you could use a toothpick and get the same response, right? It's just kind of something that's noxious into that area, desensitize that nerve bundle, which then decreases what you're feeling because your threshold is now increased for the intolerance.
Hmm.
So may have lost some people there, so I can say that again. Basically, something hurts, you do something and it makes it hurt worse, and now it doesn't feel as bad as it once did
Mm.
because that threshold has changed. So that being said, you know, I'm happy to not use dry needling because I think there's many other things that we can do, right? Because this typical analogy of the roof is leaking or your roommate has a fish tank that explodes and leaks into the living room. You can put a bucket underneath, true story happened. You can put a bucket underneath to catch the drips or the leaks coming from the ceiling, or you can go up and fix the pipe or the fish tank
Mhm.
in that scenario, right? So the better solution is going up to fix the bigger thing, the fish tank or the drain, versus catching the bucket. Because what happens? The bucket's going to get full. You have to go dump it. You're going to continuously keep catching drips until you get to the root cause of what's creating this thing. So people will think that, oh, this dry needling is solving my neck pain or solving my back pain or solving my calf pain or Achilles pain. And the reality is no, it's changing your threshold for it. But we need to look at your external load, your internal load, how you're adapting to these things, and work on that to have the long term solution. So some people, well, then isn't dry needling a good thing to use for symptom modulation? And to that, I would say, yeah, it does change symptoms. It can change people's pain response of what they're feeling, which is a good thing short term. And someone that does have really irritable pain symptoms and you need to potentially calm them down before you can start working on the framework for long-term solutions, that might be a good time to potentially use it. But it's all about the narrative that's being used,
Mhm.
right? Like if people are being told, oh, this needle is going to solve your pain issue, no, it's not. It's just going to mask it for short term. And
Mhm.
until you take care of your internal load, how fulfilled you are, your stressors, your sleep, your nutrition, all these things that make you a human, you have to address those. This little needle being poked into a sensitive area isn't going to change those things.
Mhm.
It's going to give you short term relief or more discomfort. And I will say, I've had dry needling done 3 times now. One time was in Texas. I was on a clinical in Texas, and my clinical instructor said, "Hey, we get to do dry needling here. You want to experience it?" And I said, "Sure, I do. Let's do that." And at that time was was at a great CrossFit gym. We were training like crazy. We were doing setting up for an Olympic lift competition. One of their coaches was a games athlete, so every time we showed up, we're like, "We got to show this games athlete that we know what we're doing." Needless to say, like my traps were beat up, both from the workload and then also being in a new city and not knowing how to get around and all that stuff. They needled my upper traps. It was so painful. It
Mm.
hurt so much. They're wiggling it around. My trap is twitching. My arm's twitching. And they're like, oh, there it is. Like, we found it. Well, you found something. And I don't like this right now. And I was like, but I want to experience it to know, like, what does this feel like? Like, I know what the research says, but I do want to know subjectively, what does
Mhm.
it feel like? Will it help my pain? And I will say, afterwards, I felt worse than
Mm.
feeling better. Like the next day, my trap was more sore than it ever had been. And then the day after that, they would say like, "Oh, make sure you drink a ton of water. Like that'll help it." The next day after that, I felt better, but it wasn't probably because I was better. It was because my threshold or the pain that I had actually got worse, and then went back to the baseline. And because it was back at the baseline, I experienced something that was worse. It didn't feel as bad. It
Mm.
changed my perception what was happening. So that was in Texas, and I did a CrossFit competition in New York at Rochester, and uh, acupuncturists are able to dry needle. Makes sense. Like they can do full body acupuncture, they can dry needle. So there's one at the event. I was like, you know what? I'm gonna go have it done in a place I feel a little bit more safe,
Mm.
just to see what happens. And guess what? They went for the traps again because I was like, let's make it comparable. Like we'll go for the traps. They went for the traps. It was the end of the competition. Like I did it very much at the end on purpose because I was like, I remember how I felt last time. And I tried to prep myself. Don't be biased. Don't be biased. Go in open minded and see what happens. And I had the same response. Like
Mm.
super painful, hurt. Next day felt terrible. Next day didn't feel as bad.
Mm.
Did the dry needle actually do that? Well, yeah, it made my pain response worse, so that my baseline felt a little bit
Yeah.
better. So some people love it to decrease their perception of their symptoms. And if providers are using it for that, I can definitely respect that and understand that you're trying to bring their symptoms down to open the window to get those long term solutions. But we have found other ways to do that that doesn't involve a needle being poked in. And the reason
Yeah.
it's called dry needling and not wet needling is because there's no blood,
Mm.
right? It's very superficial that you're getting. So you're going for the sensory nerve system, a lot of receptors, a lot of things that send these signals in. So you're not going deep down into the muscles, the nerves that create the twitching. So that's why it's called dry needling. But we found by cognitive reframing, helping to reshape perspective on their pain experience associated with their movement, can create a response in that session and it sets them up for long term success.
Mhm.
So that's my take on it. Any questions or anything that you would add into it?
No, I think you answered it greatly. I thought I knew what dry needling was, but you explained it better. And I did acupuncture in the midst of my like complex regional pain syndrome days, and I remember I would go from an acupuncturist to a massage therapist to a chiropractor. Like it
Mm.
was literally like one practice, so I would just go from one room to the next, and it was cool. Like I felt pampered in a sense, but that was not the thing that healed my complex regional pain syndrome. The thing that healed my complex regional pain syndrome was practicing gratitude, having positive, um, like meaningful activity in my life, reframing that season of my life, forgiveness, like the things that you mentioned, like that's what brought me greater healing than acupuncture.
Yeah, it comes to this important question that I think we should all ask. I ask myself this every day, like even with exercise with some people, how much are we just distracting the nervous system?
Mm.
Because we know that our system works on the input that it gets and then it predicts what our output should be. And there's this really cool part of the brain, the cerebellum, that's been starting to link to the predictive factors. And it's really cool because it's kind of called like the mini brain, and it's
Mm.
got really cool pictures of it. But the cerebellum, and it's not just this area; it's the whole brain and the whole nervous system and your environment. It's We can no longer say that like the cerebellum is solely responsible for this, but it plays a big role. But
Mm-hmm.
everything plays a role in it. But we know it's input comes in, your brain takes that input and then decides what the output's going to be based on what the goal is and its memories and thoughts and all of those factors. So that being said, how much are we just distracting the nervous system with all these fancy modalities that are out there?
Mm.
Dry needling, ultrasound, electrical stimulation, cold plunges. I mean, the list can keep going on, and especially now, both in the healing and in the wellness community, we're seeing more and more things
Yeah.
added on that are really, and what the science is showing is that they're really just distractors.
Hmm.
Like they do create a short term change, but it's just because you're distracting the nervous system. And when the nervous system isn't distracted anymore, it's going to go back to those things that created the issue in the first place.
Right.
So go fix the fish tank. That
Yeah.
is hard to say. Fix the fish tank.
Fish fix the fish tank.
Right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I think too, like I would hope that people would want long-term solutions, not short-term solutions. But I know that we live in a very like quick gratification culture. But the reality is like the long-term solutions are simple, not easy. They take work, but they're long-term solutions, and that is important, and that's what we should be pursuing.
Yeah. And I was recently talking with someone on some of these methods, and we also have to question, is it really the method, or was it the first time in your day that you got to be in a private room, not have your phone on you,
Mhm.
not have people coming to you asking you questions? You got to close your eyes for a little bit, and you did have someone that truly cared
Mhm.
about you, because I do think when people are using these modalities, most of them, their belief is that this thing is actually going to help you for the reasons that I learned of
Mhm.
why this methodology works. And I also believe that they haven't read the research showing that it's not happening for the reasons
Yeah.
that you think. There's a response that's happening, but it's not for what you were taught
Mhm.
is happening. It's for these other factors. So we have to start really looking and being curious. Well, what are these other factors? What is the environment set up? What is their day-to-day routine looking like? What are their habits? What are their patterns? What are all these things that lead up to that trigger point even developing?
Mhm.
And with a clinician that I mentee, we got into that discussion of, do trigger points exist? Yes, trigger points exist. They're a sensitized area that is, it's pretty superficial. It's a nerve bundle, and you can poke around and you can find them. But if you have to poke too far or too much to find them, what's the point of
Mm.
going after it? If it's a very sensitive trigger point and you just need something to maybe calm it down, sure. But we beg the question: is it just distracting? Is there something more fruitful that you can be doing for that person in that time?